In 1971, Buddy drove back to Glenville, Georgia, to visit his father. As he looked at his childhood home and the bridge over the river, he felt a wave of nostalgia. He remembered an old family friend who had once lived with them, the first woman he had loved outside his family. His father, however, did not like her because she often caused problems. When Buddy was 13, he saw a woman crossing the bridge toward their house. She introduced herself as Rose, saying she had come to live with them as the family maid. Buddy rushed inside to tell his mother, Mrs. Hillier, who wore a hearing aid. When she asked him what he thought of Rose, Buddy described her as tall and girlish. Mrs. Hillier seemed pleased, and then introduced Rose to her other children, Doll and Wasky. Just then, their father, Wilcox, arrived. He welcomed Rose warmly, praising her elegance and expressing confidence in her abilities despite her difficult past in Birmingham. Buddy became even more curious about her background. The next day, Rose played the harmonica for the children by the river, while Buddy watched from a distance, his curiosity growing. Later, when the children were in the kitchen, Rose asked Buddy about the hotel their family managed. He explained that his mother had inherited it after being orphaned at a young age. Buddy then asked Rose about her past in Birmingham. She tried to avoid the question, but he guessed that she had been hired by his father to escape a life of courtesanship. Later, Wilcox visited the house and asked Rose about her time in Birmingham. After praising her work, he playfully spanked her, causing her to run off, embarrassed. Mrs. Hillier thought Rose might be unwell, but Buddy suggested it was because she had feelings for his father. The next day, while Rose was sweeping the backyard, she noticed Mrs. Hillier studying. When she learned that Mrs. Hillier was about to finish her master's degree, Rose admired her even more. Mrs. Hillier also shared that she had been orphaned at 7, which helped Rose feel even closer to her. The children watched from the treehouse. Doll pointed out that their mother hadn't noticed Rose's feelings for their father. He believed this was because their mother's maternal instincts were stronger than any jealousy or malice. At lunch, Rose played the game, He Loves Me Not, with some beans, glancing at Wilcox. Doll noticed this. When she accidentally spilled the beans, Mrs. Hillier quickly checked on her, but Rose said she was fine. Then, Mrs. Hillier suddenly remembered her magazine presentation. Wilcox offered to drive her, but she refused, suggesting he stay home and help Rose with the dishes. Once Mrs. Hillier left, Buddy and Doll secretly watched their father and Rose in the dining room. They saw Rose try to kiss Wilcox, telling him she had feelings for him. Wilcox rejected her, blaming her for causing trouble. He told her to wash the dishes and left the room, while the children quickly left. Later, Doll and Buddy discussed what they had witnessed. Doll believed their dad truly rejected Rose, but Buddy thought he did it out of fear. Afterward, Buddy went to his room to read comics. While in bed, Rose came in looking upset. She asked if she could lie beside him for a while, and he allowed her. She then shared that she was heartbroken and confessed her feelings for Wilcox. When Buddy asked how it started, Rose explained that it began when Wilcox complimented her on her first day. Feeling vulnerable, Rose tried to keep a distance, but Buddy persisted. She told him he was too young to understand, but eventually she allowed him to be closer. That night, Wilcox woke up and talked to his wife about the challenges caused by the Great Slump. To calm himself, he made a glass of milk. Meanwhile, Rose felt guilty about what had happened and begged Buddy to keep it a secret. She worried that if anyone found out, she would be blamed. Buddy suspected it was related to her past, but Rose explained it wasn't about that. She loved being part of their family and feared being kicked out if they found out. Buddy promised to keep it a secret and assured her he cared for her. Rose thanked him and hugged him, saying she planned to move on and find someone else on her day off. The next morning, Buddy woke up late, and Mrs. Hillier scolded him, asking what he had been doing. He lied, saying he had been reading comics all night. His mother, disappointed, gave him castor oil to clear his mind. Rose proudly showed off her outfit before leaving the house. Mrs. Hillier and the children admired her style, but Wilcox thought her clothes were too revealing. Still, he and Buddy drove her to town later. As Rose walked, many men noticed her beauty. Wilcox and Buddy followed her from a distance, watching as she charmed a salesman. That evening, Wilcox told Mrs. Hillier how much Rose bothered him, saying it was tiring having the maid around. However, Mrs. Hillier defended Rose, saying she wasn't troublesome at all. Just then, Rose came home from her date. Wilcox commented that Rose's outfit made her look too provocative, but Mrs. Hillier disagreed, saying he should appreciate how hard Rose worked to look nice. The next morning, Mrs. Hillier saw a strange man in the yard, which scared her. She ran inside to tell Rose, who claimed she didn't know him. Worried, Mrs. Hillier called Wilcox, who rushed home. He chased the man, who escaped by swimming in the river, leaving behind his hat. Wilcox picked it up and threw it to Rose. When she smiled, the family became suspicious, but she quickly defended herself, saying she didn't know the man. That evening, Doll complained to Buddy about Rose not noticing what was happening around her. Suddenly, they heard fighting outside. The siblings ran out and saw two men fighting in the yard. Wilcox, hearing the commotion, grabbed his rifle and scared the men away. Afterward, he noticed Rose's shadow in the window. The next morning, while Rose served drinks to the family, Wilcox mentioned that he had trouble sleeping and asked if she had heard anything unusual. Rose confirmed she had heard strange voices the night before. Annoyed, Wilcox accused her of pretending to be innocent, saying the two men had fought over her. He threatened to fire her, but Rose firmly denied it, saying she didn't know the men. Mrs. Hillier stepped in, arguing that it was normal for Rose to have admirers and that she shouldn't be fired for it. Wilcox then explained to his wife that he didn't want to fire Rose, but warned her not to test his patience, especially with children in the house. Hearing this, Rose promised to ask the men to stay away from the house and admitted she had lied earlier, saying she did know them. Later, Wilcox took Buddy to the hotel for a game of billiards, but their time was interrupted when a staff member told Wilcox that the police chief was on the phone. After hearing the news, Wilcox went to the police station where Rose was being held. The officer explained that a man who admired Rose had almost harmed someone because of her, and that Rose had bitten a policeman's thumb. However, the injured officer, David, said he thought Rose was upset and didn't mean to hurt him. Rose agreed with David, explaining that she bit him because she wasn't feeling well. Wilcox disagreed, pointing out that she seemed healthy. Despite this, the chief decided to release her, and Wilcox had no choice but to take her home. Before leaving the house, Rose promised again that she hadn't meant to bite the officer. Wilcox told her he would talk to her later. Afterward, Buddy and Rose ran through the heavy rain back to the house. Later, while playing Chinese checkers, Doll worried about what would happen to Rose. Buddy was also curious and secretly listened to their parents' conversation to find out their decision. He overheard his mother defending Rose, saying her intentions were good, even though the incident happened. Wilcox then walked toward the house, and Buddy quickly ran to avoid being caught. Once his dad returned to the room, Buddy went back to his spot to continue listening. He heard his mother tell his dad that Rose wasn't a bad influence and that her kindness attracted many men, not her looks. But Wilcox still insisted that Rose should be fired for causing trouble. Mrs. Hillier agreed to tell Rose the decision. As she left the room, Buddy rushed to the living area to warn his siblings. Doll, upset, argued that even though Rose bit a policeman, it wasn't a good reason to fire her. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hillier went to Rose's room and found her running a high fever. Worried, she quickly called an ambulance, which arrived soon after. As they put Rose on the stretcher, she said she didn't want to go to the hospital, afraid she might die there. However, Mrs. Hillier and the children reassured her, saying she would get better with treatment. After Rose was taken away, Mrs. Hillier asked her children to join her in praying for the maid. Later, they visited Rose at the hospital and learned she had a severe case of pneumonia. Despite this, Dr. Martinson praised Rose's strength, saying it had helped her survive. A few days later, the family brought Rose home to rest. One rainy day while eating, Rose told Buddy how kind the doctor had been, saying he even shed tears after listening to her heartbeat. Buddy doubted this, and his father shared his concerns. Later, Dr. Martinson came to check on Rose. At dinner, Wilcox became uneasy, noticing the doctor had been inside her room for a long time. Mrs. Hillier reassured him, saying Dr. Martinson was a skilled doctor. Worried, Buddy and Wilcox went to check on Rose. They met the doctor on the stairs, who said she was improving. Still, both of them looked at him suspiciously as he left. The next day, Emily took Rose to Mass, and it seemed like Rose had started to change. However, one day, Wilcox caught her bringing a man named Billy into the house. Rose explained that Billy was a good man who wanted to marry her, but she couldn't because he was poor and didn't have a job. Wilcox was upset and went to find Billy's clothes to throw them outside. Rose begged him not to fire her, but Wilcox wasn't convinced and fired her right away, telling her to pack her things. The next morning, Wilcox excitedly told Rose he had found her a job in Tennessee. When she found out it was at a dairy farm, she suddenly started crying. Mrs. Hillier scolded her husband for making Rose relive her painful past. Wilcox explained that it wasn't the same farm she had come from, but Rose explained that she didn't want to raise a child on a farm, revealing that she was pregnant. Wilcox was disappointed, worrying that the dairy farm owner would not hire her because of the pregnancy. Mrs. Hillier asked Rose who the father was. Rose said the man was out of town and hadn't left a forwarding address. Wilcox started to doubt her story, but Rose insisted she was truly pregnant, telling them she hadn't had her period for 3 months and her stomach was growing. Not convinced, Wilcox insisted that Rose lift her dress to prove she was pregnant. Mrs. Hillier was shocked by the request, but her husband assured her it was only to show her belly. Rose agreed, revealing her stomach. Still unsure, the couple took her to the hospital to confirm her pregnancy, only to find out it was actually an ovarian cyst, not a pregnancy. Dr. Martinson also informed them that Rose had untreated gonorrhea, which meant she could never have children. Mrs. Hillier felt deeply sorry for Rose after hearing this. The doctor recommended a hysterectomy for Rose to reduce her impulsive behavior, but Mrs. Hillier disagreed, convincing Wilcox to reconsider. Instead, they opted to only remove the cyst. After the surgery, Wilcox told the family that Rose was recovering, and she returned to work, assuring them she would pay the bills, though Wilcox insisted she needn't worry. Rose later confided in Buddy that she planned to leave. She shared her troubled past and told him that girls value love over physical things. After a date with David, Rose excitedly announced she had found her Mr. Right. She married David, and the Hilliers attended the wedding, where she said her heartfelt goodbyes. Buddy was heartbroken by her departure, and on the way home, Wilcox joked about Rose's happiness. Later, Buddy learned that David wasn't her true Mr. Right. Rose had married 4 more times before finding lasting love. When Buddy found his father, Wilcox sadly informed him that Rose had passed away. Buddy, grieving, was comforted by his father, who reminded him that Rose had lived a full life. Wilcox assured Buddy that Rose would always be remembered.
Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay connected with us.